Hi, this is Remembering the Past with Corey Franklin, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a significant effect on our history, our society, or our culture. And tonight we're going to range afar from journalism to the movies to the environment. We're going to start out with Chris Economaki, who died recently at the age of 91. And Chris Economaki was the Dean of American Motorsports. He was in American motorsports journalism for almost 80 years. He knew more about it than anybody. He was to motorsports what Bert Sugar was to boxing. Remember, we did Bert Sugar a couple of months ago. Here's an ESPN report on Chris Economaki.
Chris Economaki, known as the Dean of American Motorsports, died early Friday morning at the age of 91. What will his legacy be?
Really an unbelievable one, Todd. I mean, to put it in perspective, Chris Economaki started out at National Speed Sport News, which at that time was a big flagship publication, which he later owned. He started there at the age of 13. Chris Economaki died today at the age of 91. So in between, obviously, many, many decades, incredible, excellent work in print, in radio, in television. He's synonymous with the Daytona 500, with the Indy 500, really invented the position of pit reporter. NASCAR chairman Brian France, Jeff Gordon, Tony Stewart, even Danica Patrick, among those, expressing sentiments, condolences to the Economaki family. This is a big, big loss, not just for NASCAR, really, but all of racing.
As I said, he was the world's expert on car racing, and he once gave a surprising answer to an interviewer who asked him who was the greatest car racer he ever saw. The interviewer was expecting an answer like A.J. Foyt or Richard Petty, and here's the answer Chris Economaki gave him.
Am I correct that you identify a midget racer as the best you ever saw?
Yeah, well, of course, he later on became a big car racer. That's correct. Bob Swanson from Los Angeles was the finest race driver I ever saw, but in a crash helmet. No question about that.
Why?
Well, he understood the car, he understood the track, he understood the rivals, he understood his tires, he understood his engine, he knew what he could do and he knew what he couldn't do, and he did it well.
Better than anybody, better than Foyt, better than Andretti.
Let me give you an example of Bob Swanson's ability. In 1936, he was an accomplished midget racing driver. The Vanderbilt Cup race was programmed at Roosevelt Raceway on Long Island. It was a zigzag or pretzel-shaped road course with too many turns. The Europeans all came with their Alfa Romeos and Maseratis and British ERAs and everything. And a California car builder who was famous for his midgets named Danny Hogan built a car for that race. And Swanson drove it. Well, it couldn't match the straightaways. He didn't have the right kind of transmission. But in the turns, he would pass Tazio Nuvolari, who won the race. Swanson would go by Tazio Nuvolari's Alfa Romeo in the corners, and Nuvolari would overtake Swanson, and it would happen over and over again. And when the race was over, Tazio Nuvolari, the famous Italian who won the race, sought out Swanson to tell him that he was the finest driver he had ever encountered on a racetrack in his career, which is quite a testament, I think, to Swanson's greatness.
It's also a testimony to Economaki's greatness that he could tell the story of a race that happened over 75 years ago. We're going to move on now to Herbert Lom, who died recently at the age of 95. Herbert Lom was a great character actor. Saw him recently again in Spartacus. He's best known for being Peter Sellers' boss in the Pink Panther movies, but he had a long and distinguished career. He was a Czechoslovakian expat who escaped the Nazis. I can't even pronounce his Czechoslovakian name. Like Peter Lorre, who escaped from Hungary, he went into the theater and into the movies. Here's Matthew Bannister, the BBC4's last word on Herbert Lom.
One of the great joys of the Pink Panther films was the interaction between Peter Sellers as Inspector Clouseau and his long-suffering and increasingly insane boss, Chief Inspector Dreyfus, played by Herbert Lom. Herbert, who's died aged 95, had started his film career often playing villains and criminals. But the director, Blake Edwards, recognized his wonderful comic timing and gave him a role which he played over 20 years. Herbert was born in Prague in 1917 and started acting there. But as he recalled, he departed for England just before the outbreak of the Second World War.
I left my country, Czechoslovakia, in 1939. My family stayed in Prague. Only I managed to leave to England. At the station in Prague, I was asked why I was leaving and where. I want to meet Greta Garbo. I said, come what may. Everybody laughed. I didn't.
He was offered a role at the Old Vic Theatre in London.
Herbert's son, Alec.
And at the same time, he was offered a job at the BBC. So he contacted his oldest friend, Walter, and asked him for his advice. at the outbreak of the war. Next day, a knock on his door at his digs, and there was a burly policeman standing on the doorstep, and he handed him a telegram and said, "Would you please explain this, sir?" My father opened the telegram, which was addressed to him, which had been intercepted by the police, and the cable read, "Take BBC."
They thought he was going to attack, did
Indeed. It caused some concern amongst the powers that be.
So he was a newsreader?
He was a newscaster, yes.
What was his first significant film role?
The young Mr. Pitt in 1942, when he played Napoleon Bonaparte.
Most people know exactly that he put his fingers into the waistcoat because he had ulcers underneath his stomach, and he put his hand through the waistcoat. But if you don't do that, people meet you and say, "It's a very, very nice film, but why didn't you put your fingers in the..." I said, "It's none of your business. You weren't playing Napoleon, I played him."
One of the distinguishing features of the character your father played in the Pink Panther films was that terrible nervous twitch. Did he come up with that himself?
He was discussing some issue with Peter one afternoon after they'd finished filming, and Peter Sellers said to him, "Don't worry, Herbert, I'll sort that." And he gave him a wink. My father was aggravated beyond belief by this wink for some reason, and then he developed it and put it in the script, and so the character grew, and in later years, when the movies went on and the scripts got weaker and weaker, they would say to him, "Could you wink here, Herbert?" And he used to reply, "I don't need to wink. Instead of me winking to get a laugh, you should write a better script."
Did they make each other laugh on set?
My father and Peter had a habit of departing from the script and ad-libbing, very often with disastrous consequences because the entire set burst into guffaws which spoiled the take.
When we acted and suddenly dropped our characters and started going, "Pooh, pooh," and we started giggling.
Of course, Herbert Lom and Peter Sellers did not get together for the first time in the Pink Panther. They were together in the great British classic The Lady Killers in 1955. They were robbers who pretended to be musicians and used an old lady's apartment for cover.
You leave it to me, Ma. I'm very good with birds.
Oh, really?
Yes. Tea, coffee, mend the plumbing, give the parrot his medicine. The parrot his medicine?
Oh! Oh, I'm so sorry.
No,
I
it's
do
all right, Mrs.
apologize.
No.
Oh, I assure you, he's never bitten anyone before.
Hasn't he?
I wonder how we're to get him down. Oh, I am so sorry, Mr. Robinson. I'll get a bandage.
No, don't bother, Mrs. Wilberforce. It's all right. Swab the decks yourself, you filthy-looking...
Herbert Lom was the last survivor from that great cast, which included Alec Guinness. He did a great turn as the Jewish neurologist in The Dead Zone with Christopher Walken.
The boy is safe. John! Are you all right? Tell me. What about the boy? You keep saying, the boy is safe, the boy is safe. What boy? You're the boy. I am the boy. She saved you. She's alive, Sam. Who? Your mother. No, that is not possible, John. She survived. John, my mother is dead. She's alive. I know her name. I know where she lives.
And he did a great turn as the Phantom of the Opera in the 1962 version of the movie. Not a great movie, but he did a great job.
And you lived down here all these years?
And I shall die down here. I'm dying already. Before I go, I implore you, allow me to finish one thing. Let me teach you to use that wonderful voice that God has given. Then you may never see me again, but you will never forget. Please, give me a little time. A month, 2 weeks, 1 week even. 1 week, and I will work a miracle. She will sing for me as she has never sung before, and I will hear my work performed.
Herbert Lom, a great underrated actor. We move on now to Arthur Ochs Sulzberger, also known as Punch. He died recently at the age of 86. His family owned the New York Times, and he was the publisher for over 30 years. He instituted a lot of changes at the paper, and he was responsible for the publication of the Pentagon Papers. Here's a New York Times report on Arthur Ochs Sulzberger.
Arthur Sulzberger, the former publisher of the New York Times, has died at the age of 86. The Times made the announcement Saturday morning on its website, accompanying the 7,600-word obituary, saying, Arthur Ochs Sulzberger died at his home in Southampton, New York. His death after a long illness was announced by his family. The Sulzberger family family has owned the Times since 1896, and Punch, as Arthur Sulzberger was affectionately called, inherited the paper in 1963 from his father. When he gained control, the Times was in poor financial condition, but he was able to turn it around, so when he passed control on in 1997, the Times was a multi-billion-dollar diversified media empire. Sulzberger oversaw one of the most landmark cases in journalism when he made the decision in 1971 to publish the Pentagon Papers as the government's history of the Vietnam War. The Nixon administration demanded the Times stop its series of articles on the papers, citing national security, but the newspaper refused on First Amendment grounds. It won its case in the U.S. Supreme Court in a landmark ruling of press freedom. Punch also saw the Times expand its coverage beyond just New York, bought the Boston Globe and International Herald Tribune, and instituted a now iconic part of all newspapers. As Bloomberg Businessweek writes, Sulzberger oversaw enlargement of the weekday Times to 4 sections, the start of its national editions, and the introduction of its op-ed page, now a staple of newspapers. Sulzberger passed control as publisher to his son Arthur Sulzberger Jr. in 1992 and remained as chairman of the New York Times Company until 1997, when he gave that to his son as well. For Newsy, I'm Logan Tittle.
Well, as she mentioned, Arthur Sulzberger's greatest legacy might be the publication of the Pentagon Papers, one of the most important legal cases of the 20th century. And here's a report on the Pentagon Papers and Arthur Sulzberger's role.
The war in Vietnam tears America apart. Anti-war activists take to the streets, and the government reacts with tear gas and bayonets. Unknown to the American public, a secret report was commissioned by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The highly classified document contains evidence of lying by the government about the reasons the war is being fought and the probability of success. In 1971, Daniel Ellsberg, one of the select group of Pentagon analysts who wrote the classified study, turns against the war.
They were prepared to prolong the war, to expand the war at each step, rather than to lose it, and Nixon was the same.
I want to end this war. The American people want to end this war.
Ellsberg believes that Nixon's pledge to get out of Vietnam is not to be trusted.
All I could do was to put out top-secret documents of history showing every previous president acted the way I claim Nixon is acting. Read this and see if you don't think you should look very closely at what Nixon is doing. Challenge him. Have hearings, call witnesses, find out whether he really means to get out.
Ellsberg leaks the secret documents to the New York Times. Editors have to decide whether to publish them. It causes a heated debate within the paper.
It went on for 3 months, and all the time we were examining it, meetings took place, and they got extremely tense at some times because one or two of the editors didn't want us to print it. They felt it was not right. Nothing like this had been done. Did we have the right to do it? Did we have the right to withhold it?
The decision to make the papers public is not an easy one. Stakes are high.
Because, if we were wrong and this was something that hurt a single soldier, we would live with it forever.
Sunday, June 13th, 1971. The New York Times begins its explosive series based on the Pentagon Papers.
I felt that we were doing our duty. I knew the government would have a heart attack.
The Nixon administration is outraged. They say printing classified documents in the New York Times risks national security.
We subscribe to the Bill of Rights, but they are not absolute in any circumstance.
The Attorney General orders the New York Times to stop, but the paper refuses and lands in federal court.
The United States of America comes into the courtroom for the first time in the history of our republic and asks for a temporary restraining order, restraining the nation's most preeminent newspaper, the New York Times, from further publishing material because of national security consideration. It never before happened.
The Nixon administration wins a restraining order against the New York Times. For the first time in U.S. history, a newspaper is prevented from printing a story. Now Daniel Ellsberg leaks the documents to the Washington Post. Publisher Katharine Graham faces the decision of a lifetime: to print or not to print.
As she told me, look, it wasn't the most cerebral of decisions, but at the end of a minute, she simply said, go ahead, publish it.
When the Washington Post is stopped from printing, a determined Daniel Ellsberg gives the documents to the Boston Globe.
Newspaper after newspaper defied the executive branch of the U.S. government, defied the president, who was telling them that for them to publish these Papers on their own initiative would endanger the United States.
The case quickly advances to the Supreme Court. 9 justices will have to decide if the government has proved the publication of the Pentagon Papers is so dangerous it must be stopped. What is really at stake? Soldiers' lives or politicians' reputations? On June 30th, 1971, in a hushed and expectant courtroom, the decision is announced. It is 6-3 for the press.
Here's Arthur Sulzberger's comments on the decision by the Supreme Court.
I think it's reaffirmed the fact that a free press in our country is entitled to run the way people like to run a free press, that the government can't just march in and stop us from publishing.
Arthur Sulzberger, an important figure in the history of American journalism. We're going to close tonight with Barry Commoner, who died at the age of 95. And Barry Commoner could be considered the father of the environmental movement. When we talked about Russell Train recently, we talked about how the country developed an environmental sense in the late 60s and early 70s. And Barry Commoner was as responsible for that as any single person. Here's a 1973 interview he had with William Buckley.
Although the ecological crisis is not the public obsession it was 2 or 3 years ago, whatever it is that was then happening to our soil, our skies, our air, and our water is still happening to a greater or lesser degree. We hope to establish here today, among other things. Barry Commoner was never a doomsayer in the style of, say, the Sierra Club, but his analysis was nonetheless implacable. He figured we had to spend in contemporary dollars about $50 billion per year over the next generation in order to win back the good graces of the ecosphere. Dr. Commoner was born in New York, went to Columbia, and took his advanced degrees in Harvard. He came then here to St. Louis, to Washington University, where his research in physiochemistry got him much renown. He is now the director of the Center for the Biology of Natural Systems. His first book, Science and Survival, published in 1966, was widely noticed, and his second, The Closing Circle, was universally admired and earned him the reputation of father of ecology, a position which I suppose we must reluctantly concede is itself biodegradable. I am anxious to probe his ecological conclusions, of course, but also to speculate on whether his prescriptions necessarily follow from that analysis. I should like to begin by asking Professor Commoner whether, since the writing of his book, The Closing Circle, there have been any developments that, for better or worse, affect his theses.
Well, there have been some developments, most of them for the worse. When I wrote the book, Mr. Nixon was putting himself forward as perhaps the George Washington of ecology. He's backed off pretty far from that. I think largely because he's begun to recognize that it's not a motherhood issue, that if we have to pay the debt to nature, it will make a difference who pays. There have been improvements. So, for example, Suffolk County, Long Island, has banned detergent. The phosphate in the Detroit River is running lower than it was because the city of Detroit banned phosphates in detergent. I think the further away you get from the federal government, the more action there is.
As I understand it, we are spending, in the 50th of Nixon's term, approximately 4 times what we were spending on ecology at the beginning of his term, and 15 times as much on the matter of water pollution alone. Your point is that we should be, of course, spending many times that much more.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Nixon was supposed to have understood the issue in a sense that what Lyndon Johnson could not have been expected to understand it.
No, I didn't say that. I was comparing Nixon's statements about the environmental issue that he made in the State of the Union message in 1970 with his actions since. He made a pretty good speech. They were good words. He recognized that it was now or never, I'm quoting.
Yeah.
That we owe a debt to nature, that we have to really exert ourselves to roll back environmental pollution. And since then, I think he's rapidly backed away from carrying out the rather good laws that Congress has enacted. So, for example, one of the most important legislative steps has been the legal provision for environmental impact statements, a requirement that every action the federal government takes has to be spelled out with respect to its environmental consequences. This is terribly important because until now we've been flying blind. Well, one of the things that I think Mr. Nixon's been doing is trying to get around that. For example, he's had a bill introduced to allow the Atomic Energy Commission to evade or not use the environmental impact statement. And I think that would be very unfortunate.
One of Commoner's most important legacies was his reports on the effect of nuclear fallout in children. To close on that note, I want to thank my producer Sid Tepps, and in a final tribute to Barry Commoner, Marvin Gaye. And his environmental song was Mercy, Mercy Me, the ecology song.
Mercy, mercy me, mercy. All things and what they used to be. No, no. Oil wasted on the oceans and upon our seas, fish full of mercury. Oh, radiation underground and in the sky, animals and birds who live nearby.